Cornversations, Episode 7. Welcome back if you have been here with us before. And if you haven't been with us before, welcome for the first time. And you're really joining at a great time in the sports calendar. We've got a ton of action going on from MLB playoffs to the NFL and college football seasons in full swing. The NBA and NHL seasons just kicked off earlier this week. And for those of you that are soccer fans, we've got World Cup qualification going on this week and into this weekend. And just around the corner are the MLS playoffs. So truly is a great time to be a sports fan. We've got the 2025 Sports Equinox coming up later this month. I believe that's October 27th. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it is all four of the major American sports leagues having a game or a match on the same day. So, again, an excellent time to be a sports fan, whether you're just paying attention to one of them or you're trying to keep tabs on everything. In particular, in college football, yesterday, and this is being recorded on a Thursday, so yesterday was Wednesday, kicked off the first of 49 straight days with football games being on. So we talked in one of the first episodes about the seemingly softening, maybe from some people who are not as into football, with watching the game all weekend on Saturday and Sunday when college football was just getting started and the NFL had kicked off. And if you haven't yet seen the end of that, you're certainly going to over the next 49 days. So good luck to any of you who are going to try and carry that through and make it a football day every day for the next 7 weeks. For this episode, we're going to go ahead and we're going to mostly stay in the football realm. We'll talk a little bit about the Bill Belichick saga that is playing out before our eyes this week, and then we'll shift over to the NFL. We're going to play a little game, buy, sell, where we'll take a look at some teams that have had either an unusually good start or an unusually bad start, and I'll give my opinions on whether or not I think those are expected to continue for those teams. And then, of course, we'll dive into the mailbag. Got a question from one of the listeners this week, so we'll dive into that to end the show. Kicking it off, the Belichick saga is something that is unfortunately going downhill a lot quicker than even I thought. And I'll be the first to say I was a hater. I did not think this was going to work out when they announced that Belichick was taking the North Carolina football job, head coaching job. I was not sold that this was going to be a win for both sides. It seemed to me like a situation where Belichick had failed to find a landing spot in the NFL, and I'll give my thoughts on maybe why that happened, but nonetheless, had failed to find a spot in the NFL where obviously he spent most of his coaching career, and found a landing spot at a program that maybe was looking for a bit of a media splash. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say desperate, but certainly North Carolina is not known first and foremost for its football program, and this was an opportunity for them to jump right into the news headlines by hiring what many people consider perhaps the greatest living NFL coach in the history of the game. But I said in my preseason college football predictions post for the ACC on Around the Corn Sports blog that I felt the Tar Heels would be flirting with bowl eligibility more so than they would be flirting with a college football playoff berth. And right now, it certainly seems like that take is being validated. But it has gotten a lot weirder than I thought it would get, and quickly. This week, it was announced that the Hulu documentary, which was to feature the North Carolina program, the ins and outs throughout this first season that Belichick has been coaching, was scrapped. So they will not be having a Hulu documentary about North Carolina football, seemingly now or in the future. This is actually the second time they've canceled something related to a documentary about the program. There was the potential Hard Knocks style documentary that was supposed to potentially take place, and that was scrapped in the summer. And there were some rumors that it had something to do with Belichick's girlfriend Jordan Hudson not liking the direction that was going. But rumor or not, that did not happen. This documentary for Hulu was supposed to happen and was on schedule to be released, but we get news this week that that's being scrapped as well. And the reasoning behind it is also similarly unclear. However, the thought is that it has something to do with the difficulties that the team has experienced this season through 5 games. And difficulties is probably an understatement. This team is 2-3 right now. They have no victories over Power 4 teams, and the games that they have played against Power 4 competition have been pretty ugly, to say the least. The opener at the beginning of the season against TCU was a disaster on national television, of course, and last week's game against Clemson was a drubbing in which Clemson got up 28-0 on North Carolina. So, needless to say, the Tar Heels are having major issues on both sides of the ball. They can't score, but perhaps more surprisingly for a Belichick team, they can't stop anybody defensively either. But that's really not what this saga is about or why it's gotten so weird. Obviously, the Hulu documentary being canceled is an interesting development, you could say, because frankly speaking, if North Carolina wanted this to be an opportunity to bring some positive attention to the program, the documentary going on, despite the struggles, would still be a good option. I'm thinking of all the sports documentaries that have come out on Netflix, Hulu, Prime, etc., and none of them have really failed. In fact, the only one that I can think of that has, by definition or by the vast overwhelming majority of people associated with a sport having failed, was the tennis documentary Breakpoint. And the only reason that one failed is because the players felt like they could have done more with it. In fact, you've even had documentaries in the past about sporting events or teams where failure has been kind of the main theme of the documentary, and those did well. I'm thinking of Sunderland Till I Die, which was a documentary that followed the Sunderland Football Club for a couple of seasons, and the first couple of seasons that the documentary aired were relegation seasons. So Sunderland went from the Premier League down to the Championship, and then in the second season, they went from the Championship down to League One. So this was a team who was struggling mightily, but yet they still seemingly put together a fairly successful documentary. So to say that it wasn't going to be a good idea because of struggles on the field seems a little bit like a cop-out answer to me. But it does get even more weird beyond the documentary being canceled, because yesterday the statement from the director of athletics of North Carolina, Bubba Cunningham, was pretty cut and dry, and one of those statements that you look at and you say, yeah, there's definitely something behind that. And the statement was, Coach Belichick has the full support of the Department of Athletics and University. And in response to that, or at the same time, simultaneously, a statement was made from Bill Belichick, I'm fully committed to the UNC football and the program we're building here. Well, okay. If that isn't a possible something is going on behind the scenes, I don't know what is. You've got the director of athletics making a one-sentence statement here about a head coach who had a lot of fanfare coming into the season but is struggling mightily, and you've got a head coach with a one-sentence liner that is also potentially looking at even paying his buyout so that he can have a soft landing somewhere else. There are rumors that Belichick is indeed open to the $1 million buyout, which would allow him to be relieved of his duties if he can find something else. And I think that does give some credence to the thought that he wasn't able to find what he was really looking for, which is an NFL job. And to take this a little bit further, because I've heard this from some people, and I know I've got some shuckers out there who are Patriots fans, and I've had this discussion with at least one of them before about the legacy of Bill Belichick. And there's some thought here that with the North Carolina decision to coach there and everything that's happening so far, that it may be time for Bill to cut his losses and not taint his legacy. And my take on that is that perhaps the damage has already been done, and it's less so about whether or not future games will taint his legacy, and more about whether or not this is just the validation that we may have overstated his impact or his instrumental nature of the dynasty in New England. We've got a coach here who, it's well known, wanted Tom Brady out of New England for a couple of years before Tom ended up going to Tampa Bay. And when Belichick got his way, the franchise did struggle. And it was a bit of a forced breakup, if you would say. Obviously, New England did not elect to fire Bill Belichick. They let him graciously step away. But it was more than time for that to happen. And things have gotten better quite quickly in New England. I made the comment to one of those shuckers who is a New England fan that it would be interesting to see what happens post-Belichick to understand whether the Crafts know what they're doing with the organization and they can survive the loss of Brady and Belichick and get back to the winning ways, or if we would see a sustained level of struggle from the franchise even after Belichick left. And yes, there was a season with Mayo as head coach where they continued to struggle, but at this point, New England does look like they're certainly on the right track, and perhaps even as early as this year might be a contender, not only in the AFC East, but for the AFC crown in general. And we're not that far away from the Belichick departure from that program. For a while, I admittedly was not giving Tom Brady enough credit for what he was able to do in terms of that dynasty in New England. But I think that at this point, everything that we're seeing from Belichick, how the program is being handled, some of the extracurriculars that are going on, but possibly most importantly, what's going on in the field, that Brady may have had an outsized role in what happened in New England. And I think that you can already have the conversation, as we're having now, that perhaps Brady's legacy was a bit overstated as a result of what happened in New England. And being removed from that and putting himself into a new situation, not just not having Brady, but being away from New England, is making that all the more apparent. So we'll see what happens with North Carolina moving forward. Looking at their schedule, it's not pretty. They've got a bye week this week, which conveniently allows for some time for all of this to potentially simmer. before they go on the road to California. That's not going to be an easy game. They've got some tough games against Virginia, Syracuse, and Duke, all teams that can score pretty well. So that defense is going to have to find a way to stop those teams. And then you've got the rivalry game at the end of the season against North Carolina State. So I could certainly see the Tar Heels losing perhaps all 5 of those games, but certainly 3 or 4 of those games. And if that happens, the Tar Heels won't be bowling this season as a team under 500, and who knows whether or not Belichick will even make it to the end. Shifting gears, though, a little bit to the NFL. It's been an interesting start to the season. We're now at the quarter point, and like any NFL season, we've had some surprises, both good and bad. So I want to take a look at those a little bit and give my thoughts on some teams that have had good starts that we weren't potentially expecting to have those starts, and then some other teams that are struggling more so than we thought they were going to. And what I'd like to do here is just give my unfiltered first take thoughts on where I see these teams heading as we make it through the next 3 quarters of the NFL season. So we'll go division by division. We'll start in the AFC with the East. And I think here we're pretty much where we thought we would be, with the slight exception possibly of the Patriots being over 500 at this point, and most recently having knocked off the Bills on Sunday Night Football last week. So the question is, are the Patriots ready to go? Are they a team that is ready to fight for the East Division crown along with the Bills? And I think the answer is yes. I think that Drake May has proven himself to be the franchise quarterback that New England thought he would be. You're getting good decision-making out of him. You're getting a team that, while relatively young, is putting themselves into positions to win games. There have been some close games that they have not won, like earlier in the season against Pittsburgh, but I think those are good opportunities for this young team to learn not only how to get themselves into position to win, but what types of things need to be done to close those games out. And I think later in the season, you might see New England in similar positions to win games, and with a near season under their belt, those close results may go the other direction. So I certainly think that the Patriots are here to stay as a team that is going to be fighting for a playoff bid, and the Bills might have more challenge than they expected this season. I think you could make the argument easily that in 2 or 3 years, most people would have expected that New England was going to be right there. But this year, they might be a little bit early, though I think they do have the staying power. In the North, things are just really unusual. Obviously, the injuries to quarterbacks has played a large part in what we're seeing so far in that division, but I don't think that we're going to see things end the way that they are currently. So you've got Pittsburgh up at number 1 right now, 3-1 on the year. Do I think that Pittsburgh is going to be a team who's going to ultimately win the division? I do not. I don't think that an aging Aaron Rodgers, a defense that is supposed to be good. They're paying them to be good. They're certainly paying that defense to be one of the better ones in the league, but they're struggling. They actually have allowed more points than they've scored this year. And I think that once some of these other teams get healthy in the division, they're going to be difficult games for Pittsburgh to win. I do see the Steelers coming back down to earth to some extent, but we'll see. The North is one of those divisions where, you may only have to win 10 games to win it. And if Pittsburgh is able to get themselves to 5-1, which seems like a distinct possibility, given that they've got Cleveland and Cincinnati coming up over the next couple of weeks, this could be a team that would have to have something of a collapse to not end up winning the division. But I think a collapse is possible, and if that does happen, then Baltimore is the team that I think is going to be right there, ready to take advantage. It's been a tough start for them. The injury to Lamar Jackson is really tough. We saw last week kind of where Baltimore is right now without him. But defensively also there's been some issues, and they're going to have to get it together quickly. But if you look at what they've done this year, the schedule's been tough. Games against the Bills, the Lions. I think the Texans are fairly decent this year, and the Chiefs. I think you could look at a lot of teams in the league going 1-4 with that schedule, and they'll get it right. I do think that they'll get it right when they're healthy, but it's going to be a tough climb. So they're going to have to get into gear relatively quickly, but I would not consider the Ravens out of things yet. Moving to the South, this one is possibly the most interesting division in the AFC this year, mostly because you could make an argument that all four of these teams are having unusual seasons, perhaps with the exception of Tennessee. With the Colts at 4-1 and the Jaguars at 4-1, you've got two teams up there that I don't think a lot of people had too high of expectations for, but one of them I see potentially having staying power, and that's the Colts. Daniel Jones has gotten a lot of flack over the course of his career, but he's playing good football right now. And if the narrative wasn't that this is a guy who was at sometimes a bumbling fool, you're looking at a guy who is potentially playing like one of the best players in the league right now. And I don't think that that's something that they're necessarily going to need for the entirety of the season for them to still be in the race for the playoffs. Jonathan Taylor's having a heck of a season too on the ground, and they're playing fairly good defense as well. So I do see Indianapolis sticking around, if only because the South might be the weakest division in the AFC, and they're going to get those opportunities against the Titans and the Jaguars to bolster that record a little bit. I'm not a fan of the Jaguars. I honestly don't know how they ended up pulling out that game against the Chiefs this week, but here they are at 4-1. Trevor Lawrence is a guy who I've had confidence in the past, but I've kind of moved off of that recently, and here he is leading the team. But there were a couple of instances in that game against the Chiefs that had they gone the other way and easily could have, you're looking at a totally different outcome there. And I think that kind of is symbolic of the Jaguars in general. They're turning over a lot of teams right now, and I just don't know if their quick start on that side of the ball is going to be sustainable. Now, you've got the Texans at 2-3, and I felt like they were the team to beat in this division. They're a little bit inconsistent, but I think you've seen flashes of what they can do offensively that suggest that they should be in the mix at the very least. And that'll likely come at the expense of Jacksonville, in my opinion, but they certainly have to get it into gear quickly. It is tough to come back from the start that they've had, and at times it's been a little bit questionable why Houston has not been able to move the football as well as they've done in the past. Moving over to the West, I think that this is possibly the best division in the NFL right now. I think that the Chargers are a good team that has hit a little bit of a snag over the past couple of games. They're hurt. When they are healthy again, I think they're certainly going to be in the mix in that division. The Broncos are effectively fulfilling the expectations that some have had for them, perhaps even extending back into last year. I think that if you're a fan of Sean Payton and what he's able to do and the confidence that he has had in Bo Nix since they drafted him, that this was going to come at some point. So I do see the Broncos being a factor possibly further into the playoffs as well if they do make it there, but it's going to be a tough division to get out of. The Chiefs at 2-3, they're going to be a team that's going to come up all season. It's already been a mailbag question about whether or not I could see them struggling and having this be the end of the dynasty, but until it actually happens, I have the confidence in Andy Reid and in Patrick Mahomes that upstairs they have the ability to make the adjustments that are going to be needed in order to survive the season. It's not just about a game to game and what's going on at certain points in the season. It's about basically surviving the ups and downs. And teams like the Chiefs and teams in other sports with guys like Patrick Mahomes are able to figure out those ups and downs. And lo and behold, when you get to crunch time, i.e. the playoffs, they always seem to be in the mix. And so I think the Chiefs are certainly capable of being one of those teams where it might not be the prettiest season this year, but they will have an opportunity to get themselves into position to compete for that ultimate prize once again. Shifting over to the NFC, the East is pretty much what we expected, with the exception of the Cowboys, who at 2-2-1 are in third place right now, but they're looking like a team who is dangerous. And I think that this one is interesting because I don't necessarily see them as a real contender for the playoffs this year, but they have the opportunity to create havoc for a lot of teams. This offense is looking as good as it's looked since Dak Prescott had Zeke in the backfield. And I heard a good take earlier this week about the Cowboys, and it was mostly about Dak, in that Dak seems to thrive and play his best when the stakes are not as high. The Cowboys came into the season with very little expectations of doing a lot of positive things, yet here we are, Dak playing some of his best football, and this is without some of his better players. CeeDee Lamb is injured. He's got a running back by committee stable in the backfield, and the line is not what it was when he first came into the league. But what is different, as opposed to other seasons where there's been high expectations of the Cowboys, is that, yeah, they're the Cowboys, but there's maybe a little bit less fanfare going on around them. And it just allows Dak Prescott to play. And he can play. He's shown it. He's shown it at various points in his career, and he's shown it perhaps most consistently when the fewest number of people are expecting that he's going to deliver. So the Cowboys are going to be I would say, a fun team to watch, but with the Commanders and Eagles in front of them and Jaden Daniels now back healthy, I think that it is likely going to be a two-team race at the top of that division, but we'll see. The Cowboys certainly could make that interesting if they keep up their good play behind their leader. In the North, it felt like this was going to be perhaps the best division in football this year. Certainly the most balanced. And I think the biggest surprise for me is that the Lions have not skipped a beat offensively. I had some questions about how that offense would respond to not having their offensive coordinator, and in the case of the Bears, now having that offensive coordinator as their head coach, perhaps you would see a downturn from Detroit and an upswing from Chicago, but so far that has not been the case. The Lions are playing as well as they were last season, and it doesn't look like they're slowing down anytime soon. So I would consider the Lions to be a bit of a surprise for me, and I think that they're going to be able to keep it up. The Packers at 2-1-1, a little bit inconsistent, but I do believe in Jordan Love. I think he's a guy that can lead teams. I think Matt LaFleur is one of the smartest coaches in the league. And so when you have that combination of quarterback and offensive-minded head coach, I think you're going to be in a position to maintain the level of success that they've started. But when you see the way that they play against Cleveland, you also wonder, okay, at what point are they going to have those slip-up games? And you can't have a lot of slip-up games in this division. Moving to the South, very little surprise here, I would say. The one surprise to me is how good the Buccaneers have actually been. And similar to a couple of these other guys at the quarterback position that I've already mentioned that have had excellent starts to the season, and maybe the impression of them has been something else based on what they've done in the past. I think the Bucs are really benefiting from the seemingly maturation of Baker Mayfield. This is a guy who has always played with a chip on his shoulder, and he's had a little bit of a cycle, if you will, of playing with his chip on his shoulder to then having a little bit of success to then maybe having that success go to his head a little bit and having a bad game that sets him back into the mode of needing to prove himself and using that chip on his shoulder. But this season, Baker Mayfield has been perhaps the best player in the NFL, and he has channeled that energy that used to sometimes come out in negative ways in a way that has propelled this team to put its best foot forward, particularly in the fourth quarter. I mean, at this point, I would argue that Baker Mayfield is the number one choice if you need a guy to go win you a game late in the fourth quarter. So I had seen some things early in the preseason and even before the preseason that the Bucs could be a dark horse Super Bowl contender, and at the time I wasn't quite sold on that, but at this point I think there might be something to it. And you look at what they're going to face near the end of the season. They've got the Panthers twice in the last 4 games. They've got the Dolphins at the end of December. They've got the Saints at the beginning of December. You've got a team that could be firing on all cylinders. They could get themselves right if there's any injuries, and actually there are injuries right now, and they're still doing a great job from an offensive perspective. I think that this team is really looking like one of the teams that might have the right combination of health and true talent when we get to the playoffs, that they could make a real run. And then there's the West. And the West is tricky because I think that all 4 of these teams have some positive aspects and qualities to them, but there hasn't really been enough consistency from any of them, maybe save the 49ers, for me to wax poetic about any of them. The Rams, I would say, were probably my pick to win the division, but they're aging, of course, and it'll be interesting to see with Matt Stafford and some nagging injuries whether or not they're going to be able to get to the finish line without limping there. But that division at this point, to me, doesn't have a lot of surprises. They're one of 2 divisions at this point. Yeah, one of 2 divisions at this point that don't have any teams with fewer than 2 losses, and everyone is within 2 games of each other. So it's a balanced league. It's a close league. I don't expect that'll change, but I really don't see a lot of huge surprises either way in that division so far. So we'll go ahead and we'll open up the mailbag at this point. And I know that the mailbag is also an NFL question, so we're going to stay on the topic of football almost 100% today. This one comes in from Matt or potentially Sarah. I'm not really sure who. It looks like both of them may have had some input here. So, Matt, Sarah, thanks for sending this one in. Your question that you asked was, do you believe that the Eagles will make A.J. Brown available? And by available, I assume they mean here up for trade. And what should a team be willing to give up to get him? My team needs playmakers. All right. I assume that this is talking about the actual on-the-field football and not from a fantasy perspective, because there's also some question marks from fantasy players out there as to whether or not A.J. Brown is a guy worth floating as trade bait. But on the field, I think this is a really difficult question to answer because the talent is clearly still there. A.J. Brown is not slowing down at all from what we can see. He's expressed some frustration due to the lack of pushing the ball downfield. But if you look at what the Eagles have done in the past, and specifically what they were able to do last year during their excellent run that they had leading up to the Super Bowl victory, this isn't a team that actually throws the ball a ton. In fact, they're more run-oriented, and the bigger surprise to me this year has been the lack of running game that they have decided to employ. And I think that, if anything, you can say that perhaps most obviously the loss that they had to Denver last week, the issue that Philly is having isn't necessarily the inability to get the ball to their guys downfield, but their unwillingness, you could say, to utilize their most talented player, which is Saquon Barkley. I believe it was 11 carries last week that he had, and through the season, he has about 270 yards rushing, which only narrowly eclipses what he was able to do in one game last season. And some of this might be the play calling from the new offensive coordinator, but I think what this also might be is just simply another cycle of this offense being inconsistent and unpredictable. They've gone through this before, where the question has been, why are they not running the ball, and why is the offense sputtering, especially with all the talent they have. But this is, to some extent, something that, as an Eagles fan or as somebody who is a fan of A.J. Brown, for example, you almost just have to kind of accept that it is part of the offense in Philly. This is a team that, on a dime, and we're recording this on Thursday night, so they're playing tonight, could flip the switch, and A.J. Brown could go off and have 11 catches for 140 yards, and suddenly everything looks like it's great, and they could have a 3-week span where he does the same thing. But then later on in the season, and I think what we've seen kind of to start the season is, yeah, there's a lot of questions about what they're actually doing. Why are they not utilizing the talent that they have? I don't personally think that A.J. Brown is going to be on the dock for a potential trade. And if you're another team, it probably doesn't even make a whole lot of sense to think about what that would look like. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Matt and Sarah, about whether he would be on the trade block, or I think it answers the question about whether he would be on the trade block. I would say the answer is no, but in terms of what you would potentially float to get a guy like that, I think you'd have to give up a lot. This is still a guy who, depending on the offense that he's in, is a possession receiver who can do a lot of damage for you. So Philly's offense is a bit of an enigma, but it's something that has been an enigma for a while, and there's no shortage of possibilities in terms of where they can place the blame. So it'll be interesting to see what they do, but I certainly think that given the talent that they have on the field, and especially the one that's holding the ball most often, that they're going to be okay. It just might be a bit of an uncomfortable ride if you're a Philly fan throughout the season. That's all we've got today. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you're a fan of the show and you'd like to interact a little bit more, we're on all socials. I forgot to mention that early in the show, so hopefully you've stuck with us for the entirety, especially if you're new. We can be found at Cornversations on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts. If we're not on one that you do listen to, let us know. We'll try and get on there as soon as we can. We're also on socials, at cornversationspod on Instagram, at kbex_ATC on X, and a Facebook page, Cornversations. We can also be reached at cornversationspod@gmail.com. Leave us a mailbag question on any one of those platforms. We check them all. We try and make sure we gather them before the next episode, and we get you involved. That's the whole reason we do this and the whole reason we're called Cornversations. So hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope we'll see you back again. Enjoy the weekend. We've got a really good weekend of college football coming up. MLB playoffs, NBA and NHL in full swing. Starting to rehash some things from the episode, so it's time to close her up. But until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.